Do you know who hates World of Warcraft players more than anyone else? World of Warcraft players. Search your feelings, but you know it to be true. After all, aren't we the worst? Both sanctimonious about the game's influence and longevity, while at the same time constantly acting as the put-upon, forgotten sibling, like we've been put in the crawl space under the stairs in a fantastical story by a transphobic British woman. WoW players love to have it both ways. And in many ways, it's a lot like professional wrestling fandom if you're familiar with that. We are our own worst enemies. We believe ourselves to be the keepers of some great lore and history, going back decades upon end, and it's no different with World of Warcraft. But at the same time, we nitpick and complain and gatekeep to an absurd degree. But why? Is that the nature of fandom? Do all things just fall apart? Is decay inevitable? I think a great parallel is looking at the twists and turns of the Star Wars fandom, which has held a similar place in the entertainment space, but for double the length of Warcraft. A scrappy can-do series that becomes a cultural juggernaut, which loses its influence but never truly goes away, only to come back with an attempt to return to mainstream providence multiple times. All the while, its biggest cheerleaders are also the thing leading the charge for the most negativity. It's how you get people who used to scream to the walls about how the prequels were the worst thing ever to happen in the history of forever, and have now moved on to talking about how Star Wars was never political, and think that some great attempt at ruining the franchise has been made in the last 5 years. And inevitably you walk down the hallway towards the great Ewok debate and decide to not open that door at all. But hey, maybe that is the nature of fandom. Just like how at any given moment, a large part of the American electorate simply doesn't care about voting or the stakes at work. So too does fandom suffer from a problem that they can only view their entertainment through the lens of not being about real world experiences and how real trauma dictates fictional storytelling every single time. So it's been with the World of Warcraft franchise, which has lived through 3 decades, multiple presidents, numerous financial collapses, and more. Just like me, a millennial. What if not World of Warcraft is the perfect lens for which we view the world? And that's certainly something that the game, its creators, and the fan bases have fought for the last 8 years or so. The post-Battle for Azeroth era has seen a lot of turning of the knobs when it's come to the game and its overarching story, how it's portrayed, and reactions from core fan bases. Now, is this because of the parallels to the real world that a long-running fictional world like Warcraft will inevitably draw? Is it because the franchise is running out of steam? Or do we simply live in a reality now where the largest minority of people have the biggest microphone for which to bludgeon you to death with it? Well, I mean, let's talk about that. I've been gone for a while, and that's been due to a combination of things, but I think one of the biggest has just been not wanting to engage with the critiques of the game from an audience who isn't actually interested in experiencing a living product as they try to dictate what direction they feel the game should go. And honestly, fandoms can sometimes be the worst part of being a fan of something. Look as no greater example than the Steven Universe fandom, which kind of ate itself alive because they couldn't stop fighting about what interpretations of characters meant and how things should be portrayed. And before you knew it, Cartoon Network canceled the show and neither side had anything to fall back to. But part of that and this urge to look at these things comes from my time in the past few years being a senior editor of a gaming website, creating WoW content literally daily, and seeing the reactions from fans and players in a way that I typically either wouldn't seek out or interact with if it hadn't been part of my job. Like, I make a point of not looking at the WoW subreddit for a reason. And yet, if you write for an SEO farm, you have to know what's going on. And that's the thing that's bothered me most for the last few years, has been the sentiment that World of Warcraft, quote unquote, isn't the way it used to be. There's a whole lot of back in my day boomerism in the WoW oeuvre. You see it every day. And you see a lot of complaints that Blizzard has taken the quote-unquote war out of World of Warcraft, in lieu of the last few expansions that have seen a rise in stories about unity, emotions, and a broken world trying to put pieces back together instead of humans and fantasy monsters chopping each other to bits. And that's true. A post-battle for Azeroth state of World of Warcraft has had a larger focus on the awe of exploration and how groups rebuild after war, how those same groups try to work together for a catastrophe, and how that kind of peace is on a constant tightrope. This is just one reporter's opinion, but I find those kinds of stories far more interesting than constant rehashes of how the Horde and Alliance should just hate each other, because a large swath of players say their favorite memory of playing WoW was ganking the other faction outside small cities for hours on end. But that's just me. However, it's hard to ignore that there is a section of the player base and of people who enjoy fiction in general who get this idea lodged in their heads that the real-world problems and politics have no place in fantasy universes, that there's no connective tissue between the things that happen IRL and the things that happen in lowercase OW. So today on Essence of Azeroth, we're going to explore some of the biggest moments, and really, in my opinion, the biggest moment in WoW lore that has direct connective tissue to the real world. Look at the themes and how they influence the larger story of this universe. Along the way, I'm also going to talk about the nature of fiction and why it's literally impossible to make apolitical art, even when it's just a bunch of humans and orcs killing each other. This is Essence of Azeroth. Today's episode is brought to you by the one donor on Patreon who forgot to turn off their giving after I vanished for a full year. Thank you. You've bought me coffee a couple of times each month, and I smile every time, even though I don't deserve it. And now, on with the show. Promotional consideration for Kalimdor Public Radio is brought to you by Hogger. Ugh.
Hello, me am Hogger. Do you hate stupid humans? Maybe like Blueski gear? Then come see Hogger and friends just south of Stormwind. We have good time. Bye! KPR is not responsible for any heroes under level 10 who make contact with Hogger and lose all their gear, their gold, and their underpants. On October 18, 1945, a military tribunal taking place in Nuremberg, Germany, decided the fate of 199 at the time alleged war criminals in the wake of World War II. The plans and processes for these trials had actually begun earlier in the year after the surrender of Nazi Germany, with President Harry S. Truman appointing his chief prosecutor for the case, along with a council of the Axis powers later called the International Military Tribunal, arranged by the London Agreement. This council held the unenviable task of holding accountable the last remaining vestiges of Nazi leadership after the suicide of Adolf Hitler. But the Nuremberg trials were more than just a black and white court case. More importantly, and more to the point, the trials were about assessing and assigning the moral judgment of those on trial and providing irrefutable evidence of Nazi crimes, offering a history lesson to the defeated Germans and delegitimizing the traditional German elite. In other words, it was more than just saying that a war criminal was guilty. This was a hearts and minds affair, and it should come as no shock to anyone that those on trial did not see it that way. Anytime someone who doesn't read or follow history tries to bring up post-World War II, it almost always comes in the form of pointing out how the Nazi leaders were just following orders and trying to extol the virtues, or lack thereof, around groupthink and the power of political assuagement and the true meaning of loyalty. But I'm not a 7th grader or a crypto bro, so go somewhere else if you want some of that good old-fashioned, it really makes you think statements. The fact is that in the 70 or so years after this event, we've really learned nothing as a cultured people about the nature of blame, of leadership, and what evil looks like. Let's take, for example, former German Grand Admiral Karl Dunst, a man who would succeed Hitler as head of state in May of 1945. A former naval hero across 2 world wars, Dunst was also the man who signed the formal surrender for Germany, even after being directly named in Hitler's will as the man who would take over the Nazi regime. Dunst was, by his own words, dedicated to the words of Hitler and of the Nazi agenda. He was found not guilty of committing crimes against humanity, but guilty of committing crimes against peace and war crimes against the wars of law. Karl was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. Following his release, though, he lived in a village near Hamburg until his death in 1980. This man, a fervent Nazi and once called the Hitler Youth poster child, was allowed to live out his life for almost 40 years, having supposedly served his time. But was justice really served? Was the man who went under oath at Nuremberg and decried the quote-unquote poison of Jewry truly not guilty in a court of his peers on the charges of crimes against humanity? In the eyes of the courts and on record, Dunst's crime was that he killed with machines of war, and that not that he had lessened an entire people into inhumanity, nor that he had continued that line of thinking even after the trials, famously saying that if it had been the Americans deciding his fate and not the Jews, that he would have walked free. Now, you could be wondering if I've become so disenfranchised with World of Warcraft that I have stealth turned this podcast into a history show, to which I would say no, and that hardcore history doesn't have anything to worry about little old me. However, I was roused recently, yet again, as I tend to do, from a WoW slump after diving into the literature of my least favorite period of time in the WoW timeline itself, the end of Mists of Pandaria and to the start of Legion. Yes, I am talking about Warlords of Draenor, the black sheep of the Warcraft expansion family, and the fairly objectively declared point of decline for the quality and popularity of World of Warcraft. If you ask 20 players what their least favorite expansion is, and I'm willing to bet at least half of those people will say Warlords and without hesitation, well, another will say 5 to 7, and, well, they'll hedge it and call it their second or third least favorite. The point is, it's unpopular. And while I have no love for Shadowlands or Battle for Azeroth, it's still hard to not declare Warlords of Draenor a failing on all levels, from story and lore to content, raids, and more. Which isn't to say that there isn't some very good stuff in that expansion. I'll talk a little bit about that later. After all, I still find myself going back to those raids for transmogs constantly. And I can even see the argument for why Blizzard thought that returning to a version of its arguably most popular expansion in the Burning Crusade was a good idea. On paper, it works. Player housing, a sprawling campaign with the first appearances of the franchise's most known characters, there is appeal. But execution is another matter, and in the case of its story, I've always found multiple faults, the biggest of which starts and ends with one Garrosh hellscream. At one time, a hot-headed fan favorite orc general of the Horde, Garrosh goes through several storyline evolutions in his time, which includes a stint in Northrend as a legit war hero for being made de facto war chief of the Horde, turning into a racist warmonger and eventually being placed on trial after the siege of Orgrimmar, and in a trial and book very much styled after real-life ones I have just described from Nuremberg. And much like the Nazi High Council, the Pandarian trial involving Horde, Alliance, and everyone in between was not a trial of culpability. No, Garrosh was far past that. Instead, and similar to real life, The war crimes of Garrosh Hellscream were up for debate because of a need to name evil in the public and to lay bare evil at work, to set an example. Yet we find a Garrosh Hellscream on trial here to be not too unlike the real-life Nazis, at best unashamed of his actions and at worst proud of them. The short list of crimes include mass murder, assassination, the displacement of an entire race under his protection, the use of weapons of mass destruction, subjugation of his people, slavery, forced pregnancy, and more. And despite that list, you'll find plenty of fans who, either for realsies or being tongue-in-cheek, will say Garrosh was right, because fandom gonna fandom. Remember, fans are the worst. I had recently worked with somebody who was so down bad for Garrosh in a very weirdly literal and non-jokey way. Constant posting of Garrosh memes for their level 100 character of Garrosh and Heroes of the Storm, dropping references in places wherever they could. In short, it was weird, but as part of a larger issue, it had sparked a thought in my head at the time about the nature of evil and killers and our cultural attraction to the personality of mass murderers. Even caught red-handed, the high regime of Nazi Germany saw no fault in their actions. And in the wake of the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing, girls were reported to be sending the bomber love letters and words of comfort after his actions. Even from my own experiences, I remember sitting in the newsroom of the Toledo Blade the day after the Colorado movie theater killings in Aurora, in which 12 people were killed and 70 were injured, and reading in fairly abject horror about the people who felt empathy for its perpetrator, James Holmes. And while reading the WoW War Crimes novel, my mind immediately returned to sitting in that newsroom as the book details the orcs and the followers of Garrosh who still wish him free and think that justice isn't being done. And I think about the human obsession with serial killers, and I'm all over the idea that Garrosh Hellscream is always really leading me to ask one question. Is there any true sense of justice? Or are we all lying to ourselves? Is the cultural idea of showing that justice is done more important than providing actual justice? And that's just one plotline from WoW that is heavily informed by real-world events. Funny enough, it is also something in our 2025 Trump world that brings about questions of the nature of law, order, and who deserves a fair trial. It's no secret that the state of the illegal removal of undocumented citizens in my country, the United States, is one of many hot-button issues. For the past 100 days, the news has been inundated with stories about supposed gang members being deported to a for-pay prison in El Salvador as part of our current administration's push to solve the so-called border crisis. And in the process, supposed criminals are not being given their day in court and due process that they are owed, whether or not they are a legal citizen. As these things have been happening, I've been reflecting more and more on the War Crimes novel, which I went back to again, and the state and case of Garrosh, and one of the core tenets of a democracy, that everyone has the right to be judged by a jury of their peers. Of course, the nature of Garrosh's trial is extremely different than the real world. The reasons Garrosh is sent to trial rather than just killed both have exegetical reasons, but also developer and storyline-driven ones as well. First, the exegesis, which is to say the nature of the story as it exists as a story, and not just as a critical reading of it. A good example is a song in a Broadway play, where a character sings their feelings in the plot. If you pretend for a moment that you are a character in that world with no outside knowledge of our human real world, are you seeing that character sing? Are you seeing anything at all? The exegetical reading of that scenario is that you, the fictional character, aren't seeing that character sing at all, but instead are talking, and that their feelings and emotions are squarely under a bubble that doesn't escape that world. Meanwhile, there's a more critical reading of that same scene where we take into account themes, emotions, the staging, and the things that are self-referential to it. This is all to say that when we look at something in an exegesis kind of way, we are taking it at face value from the perspective of the characters in that story. It is their lives. We broke this down similarly in the episode about theology and religion when asking if true believers of faith could really exist in a world where literally gods and deities are just constantly present. And we ask it here again about the reasons why Garrosh would go on trial in a world that has seen nothing but war from a faction of people in the Orcs who pride themselves on honor, and from an antagonistic side in the Alliance who want to be paid in blood. From that exegetical perspective, it's a move that is wildly unpopular. Alliance citizens want revenge. Horde citizens feel that they are owed a sacrifice at best, and at worst want to show that Garrosh wasn't one of them, so to speak, not accounting for the contingent of people that think, as we said earlier, Garrosh did nothing wrong. Meanwhile, our main heroes of the world, Jaina, Sylvanas, Anduin, Chief Bloodhoof, and more are forced to confront not only their own feelings, but also what's best for the world going forward. Does a monster like Garrosh deserve his day in court, even if it's a foregone conclusion? It's a hard question that fiction is apt to answer because it gives readers the ability to explore that hard question and situation with relatively low risks, other than, feeling bad afterwards. It's a thought experiment. But one real-world parallel I came across recently rang true, and that was the sentencing of Saddam Hussein. Captured and tried for his crimes against humanity and his own people, there's an argument to be made that the trial was a farce. Not only was he seen as completely guilty, and rightfully so, but his trial was also a political statement on part of the US regime to make an example of their power, even in a war that has ended up stained and reviled in the history books. And as I watched the video of Saddam's sentencing and his reaction of complete obstinance, he's sitting there stone-faced up until the point that he is actually sentenced to death by hanging, and then begins shouting, liberty for the people of Iran. I once again thought about Garrosh and war crimes and his trial. And with that also came the reaction of WoW players at the time and as well as now. Plainly put, the Warlords era of WoW is often the most put upon, and for more than one reason. And I will admit, as I said before, it is my least favorite expansion. That said, I think there's a lot of really great things that came from Warlords. Garrisons were an interesting idea that has helped shape and inform what player housing will end up inevitably being. The expansion was a chance to see some classic characters in the game for the first time ever. Fantastic transmog, still some of my favorite transmogs, especially from the Hellfire raid at the end. But for a lot of players, Garrosh was both a plot point lingered upon too long and a scapegoat for why WoW's storylines had meandered. I remember players being tired of Garrosh and his antics as far back as Wrath of the Lich King. And as those early seeds were planted for his takeover of the Horde, it just kind of kept coming back, and you'd be hearing it again and again. And if we're being honest, his storyline is the real first time that war as a concept was put back into Warcraft. I mean, yeah, Horde and Alliance had little love for one another from vanilla until about Kata, but a lot of that was the result of the game needing a gameplay element with PvP things to do and finding ways to make the two factions butt heads in ways that didn't affect the larger storylines too much. It's the difference between having the Night Elves and Orcs hate one another in vanilla because they can't stop killing each other or chopping down trees, versus what we're seeing about to happen out in Arathi right now, with humans having an anti-orc sentiment and the likes of even Danath Trollbane softening his stance on something that he used to be the face of. All of that is to say that I think I actually really like Warlords of Draenor and the Trial of Garrosh, and I've come around on it, because it feels like a real attempt at WoW's exegetical world to fix their broken pieces and try to find some kind of healing. Of course, you have the bad actors who are there to keep the plot ever propelling forward, with Sylvanas and her sister wanting to kill Garrosh outright, Tyrande pulling her first but not last bout of Breaking Bad, and the inevitable dusty finish of the Infinite Dragonflight, making the entire book a moot point. But sometimes all of that doesn't matter. What did matter is that Garrosh was put on trial in a public way, both as a way to provide solace to two sides looking for very different things, but also to inspect the nature of evil and if Garrosh held any true regrets. It's a shame that the events of war crimes is largely missing from in-game. There's a lot of great turns, whether it's Bloodhoof finding himself as the defense attorney for the man that killed his father, or seeing an Alliance goody two-shoes like Tyrande become absolutely ruthless while still being in the right. Once again, not the last time that'll happen. The larger point being that even a monster like Garrosh got his day in court. The worst, most guilty person imaginable in this case was still owed the right to be heard. It's a rare case of the WoW universe stopping to reflect on the nature of these years-long wars and the two sides butchering one another. Admittedly, it's not something that you stop and reflect on in between killing 20 pigs and waiting a half hour in the dungeon queue for a tank. And these are the moments of WoW that really draw me in personally and keep me coming back. For others in the fandom, these are the worst parts, the ones that take away precious time from getting loot, ganking people, and having the biggest penis in Stormwind. But we all come to WoW for different things. Or at least we used to. I actually kind of get mad when I think about the push the last few years that WoW is somehow not itself or lesser than because there's more of a focus on the Horde and Alliance trying to figure out how to get along. And the idea that peace can exist. Like, peace drives people crazy. And it's because the same people that hate it are the same ones who complained for years that the WoW they knew didn't exist anymore. These are the same ones who eventually helped bring back WoW Classic into existence and came to the realization that you can't really go back home again. Which is another story for another episode. My point being is that fictional stories are better and more fulfilling when they're given the chance to explore the realities of the real world, but within their own boundaries. The idea of a war criminal being brought to justice, even if it was temporary, is one that is almost anti-video game. What do you mean I fought the big villain and he's not dead? But he got a trial. What is that? Ugh. And to go even further, I think it's an amazing choice that Garrosh's eventual fate wasn't in the hands of players, but in a field in one-on-one battle against his oldest friend and worst enemy out in the world of Draenor. Garrosh didn't want pity, and he didn't want to say sorry. He wanted to go out the way he lived, fighting. And I think that's a far more interesting point than anything Blizzard could have done. World of Warcraft is in a weird place right now, and I say that as someone who has played this game too damn much and is currently on a very intentional break from it. We have an idea of where the story is going right now, thanks to it being the first part of this major trilogy that is happening. But it also means that there's just a lot of time to kill, and that tends to make people a bit punchy. I came across a thread on Wowhead yesterday about the upcoming storyline in the Arathi Highlands involving the humans and orcs and the growing conflict there that has been brewing since the introduction of the Arathi forces in Dornogal. And it's one that I personally think is compelling. Reflecting on the nature of a war-torn place such as the Arathi Highlands is exactly what I want from a game that's persisted for 20 years. A zone that has gone through massive changes and huge scenario set pieces over and again. But what happens when we stop and ask about what real-world implications are involved? That's compelling. And some players are mad, the likes of Danath Trollbane, a literal flag bearer for killing orcs, trolls, and more for his entire existence, has maybe turned a corner, gotten some age, and saw things in a different light. And maybe that's the difficult part of a living game like WoW that is both expected to progress, but can seemingly also never escape its past. After all, seeing the atrocities we also expect this world to move on past is as simple as hopping a portal and going back to old content and reliving it. It's always there. It's a world that has both moved on, but also isn't ever allowed to. And that is an exegesis versus game development battle. On one end, these characters need to grow, change, and move forward. It's why I loved what Dragonflight did for the game's tone and structure so much, I loved that we were seeing more interactions with the main characters of the world and giving them a chance to do something other than exist as pawns in an alliance versus horde world. The short story about the wedding where everyone attends is still one of my favorite pieces of writing that has ever come out of WoW, because it has a breadth and levity to it. And these characters who were typically only allowed to snarl and bleed were given a chance to do something else. And on the other hand, that doesn't make for exciting gameplay for a contingent of the audience that has expected World of Warcraft to be one thing and one thing only. How do you balance that? How do you factor in these characters that are growing older, and so are we as players, but at the same time require that nothing ever change and that the game wraps us in that comfortable, familiar cocoon? I don't know if you can. I don't know if a game is supposed to last for 30 years. Maybe stagnation and decay are the only things that can ever be left. That's really what the World Soul trilogy seems to be about. The inevitable death of all things, and that we are inevitably left with just the fragments and memories of the things that have come to pass. Maybe that's why I led off this episode with saying something as obviously inflammatory as World of Warcraft players are the worst, even as I make that remark about myself. We want it all ways, and we also don't want this world to change. We need it to be all things to all people. It needs to be an escape from reality, but also a reflective mirror of possibilities. And that is the struggle with art, no matter the medium. We cannot create things without our real world experiences influencing them. It is literally impossible, unless your goal is to make bad art, in which case, go right ahead. Games cannot be apolitical. Fiction cannot be apolitical. Entertainment cannot be apolitical. To try and do so literally makes it about politics with that one action. And so goes with World of Warcraft, when people who live in a real world of blood, of the avoidance of due process and a rolling back of rights, also get mad that their video game is holding up a mirror that they don't want to look into. What happens? Look into the mirror, my friends. It's only showing us what we deserve. Thank you for listening. Next time on Essence of Azeroth, what's up with warlocks? I mean, really. It's time for another episode about the lore and history of its classes, and we'll dig into the warlock class. Sometimes the friends we make along the way are the ones we summoned and sacrificed for a 10% haste boost. Take care.
Hello, me am Hogger.